Cool. All right. Hi, I'm Michael Milewski. I used to work a lot in Ruby and Rails. I now work at the Martech. Hang on, let me get the spiel. Martech is an AI-powered platform that helps enterprises easily collect and share real stories from their employees so they can attract talent and build culture at scale. And today I am going to give you a few tales of test-driven development. I was going to give this talk originally at Ruby Sydney, but that kind of fell through. So let's see how we go, and maybe I will give you something to think about in terms of testing. Where do I press? Here. All right, that's not going to update that. Why is that? Oh, it did? All right, we'll see what happens. Okay. Change is hard. Who here has changed something in their development stack in the last year? All right, AI. But over the last 5 years, who's changed their shell? Okay, a fair few. All right, cool. Who's convinced somebody to change something? All right. Still a few hands up there, about let's say 10%. But I'd probably imagine that it's hard, okay? Now I'm just going to see if this is going to work. That's rubbish. So I'm updating it here on the screen share. It's not doing it there. And then I move it across and it does. All right, I'll just go without the notes. So change is hard, but somebody changed recently. PewDiePie started using Linux, right? And then that led DHH to, after being a fanboy of Apple for over 20 years and probably making a bunch of us Apple fanboys, girls and the like, he's switched over to Linux as well. The one that most inspires me is the Primogen. He's also switched across to Arch Linux recently. Okay, but this is not a talk about Linux. This is a talk about some of the things I'm going to show you. I'm going to ask you to change, and we're going to see if that goes anywhere near with any luck. The video links are in my repo, which is going to be shared, or probably already has been shared in the issue of this talk. The Primogen video is actually really good to watch because amongst other things, apart from saying that he was wrong and Arch Linux is actually the best way of doing it, he talks about 2 other things that I hold really, really dearly. One, always use your defaults, right? So his view is don't go and try and specialize your system, use the defaults. And there's a whole bunch of reasons to do that. The other one he does, which again, I feel very strongly about, he says, learn to type. Touch type. Don't have the cognitive overload to have to think about typing. And I think what's interesting is it's even more relevant now that we're using agentic and AIs all the time than it has ever before, right? Before, if you were writing a function, thinking about the function was going to be more important. Now, when you just want to get the answer and you want to be as complete in asking a question, being able to type quickly without thinking about it and being able to read the response relatively quickly is super important. It's also important as we're in a more remote workforce, because obviously those things kind of pay. We'll come back to that, but this is a talk about testing. It's the only thing I know how to talk about. How do you test? Wrong. Okay, right. This is an opinionated talk. Heckling is more than welcome, except I've got the mic. You've only got a cube. I've written tests in a whole bunch of companies. They haven't necessarily listened to my view on testing. Some have taught me on my view on testing. But yes, it is quite an opinionated talk, and I'm hoping that you may agree with some things, you may not. This is where I should have had the notes. But let's go. Everything is a function, right? So, I mean, in general, everything is a function. Like, there's other ways of doing it, but generally you take some input, you processes, you get some output, whether that's a website, whether that's, some kind of software that gathers information about money, transactions, etc. Take some kind of input, output. And that's the beauty of testing, right? Because that means if everything is a function and everything you can wrap around with a known input and a known output, you can test it. So let's use an example. I hate not having examples, so we're going to use an example. This is just a toy kind of example. You've got some CSV in and you want some stats out, right? So you may have some comma separated values and maybe you want to get average, median, count, maybe a spread, right, of things. And obviously, well, some sites do use this, right? So this is exactly like an Amazon star rating, for example. Similar kind of things. How many people reviewed what star they had? And probably the first thing you might do is spike it out, right? Like, how hard can it be? I'll get some CSV, I'll read it, I'll read the symbols in. I will then keep track of the ratings, how many there are, maybe in an array, and the sum. And then I'll do some pretty printing output at the end. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of us finish, right? And ship it, right? That is the legacy code that we still see in a bunch of places and a bunch of companies, in a bunch of side scripts that are like, this is never going to live. And you get told 5 years later they're still using it. Yes, you could ship it, but where is it going to fail? Well, it's going to fail if you're going to refactor it, right? If you're going to change it. And my favorite thing with having tests and refactoring it is often you say, can't you do this, this, and this? And the other developer goes, no, that doesn't work. If you've got tests, you can try this, this, and this, and 90% of the time it does work, and the other developer's going, oh, I didn't know that was a feature of Ruby or Rails or whatever, right? On extensions, sooner or later, you're going to come back to that code and you're going to have to extend it, right? You're going to have to kind of see what else you can do, make it better, build on top of what's there. And if you've got no kind of trust in what's there, how it works, or if you change it, if it still works, that's really hard. And obviously it could fail in production. So how does that code fail that we just saw? Well, you need to run it manually, right? That's the only real way to do it. And as we start in developer world, often that's what we do. One option though, and maybe a lot of businesses are pushing for this, or maybe a lot of Agile or XP evangelists is like, you should be testing. So a lot of people take this as well. We better write some tests. In a bunch of places I've been at, that turns into test last development, right? And there's a bunch of places that probably wouldn't admit that that's what happens, but that happens at those places where at the, oh, why is this card delayed? I haven't written the tests yet. And it's like, okay, all right. What's the problem with, well, okay, so what would you do to test that? So I found some credits for my AI because I haven't written Ruby in 2 months, and you'd be surprised how quickly that disappears. And I just said, write me a test for this, right? So it's doing some kind of, it's a process RB file, right? So it has to reach in and read open, use open file to actually read the standard input. But it's created a temporary file. It's found that file, run it, captured standard out, standard error, status. And then it's kind of run some expectations on that to say, hey, do I have this input, output? And then just for my own little sanity, I thought, well, why don't we just check the whole output? In this case, it's a test file, but why not? And again, at this point, somebody goes, ship it now. I've got testable code. But again, it still doesn't help us with some of those initial things like extension, right? If you want to extend this, this test suite's going to break, or you're going to have to add things here. It's going to grow if all of a sudden you're doing 50 different stats, or you're supporting different formats of not just CSV, but JSON, etc. It's going to fail. And obviously, when you run it in the fashion of RSpec, all you get is that little dot, right? That's success. Which, if you talk to like a 1970s Unix guy, they would go, that's great. Like you've saved us on bits and bytes. It's ASCII plain character. It is a little bit more because it's green. So there's probably characters around it. It doesn't come up green in this, but it's got some extra characters. But it's that kind of like succinctness. But I'm saying we've got to get away from that, because I've said beforehand we should learn to type. We should learn to read what our agentic AI comes back with. And if our tools are right now doing that, it's probably not a good thing. Easy solution for that, but I think that's not in this talk. So that is test last development. But what fails? Well, when I actually did that and ran that, nothing failed because it was successful. And that's what often happens where people fail, where people ship that, where it means they don't even know how it failed. Right? They don't know, does it fail? Am I even running against the right file? Right? Maybe I've got two CSV translators and I've called the wrong one. Right. So this whole idea of did it fail, and often as people add tests afterwards, they miss that. And again, what is tested and what isn't? In this case, you could easily get away with like, well, I tested the function in and out, but maybe there was a particular quirk where there was a different way of dealing with some kind of particular data or some branch in the code. Did that get tested? I don't know. And there are coverage tools, ways you can get around that. What you may do is, I thought there was an extra slide here. Sorry, I'm just gonna, what you may do is, well, write a proper, like expand processor to be a class and write a proper RSpec test, maybe from the outside in. But you may use something that a lot of us may have heard, which is better specs, right? Who here has heard of better specs? Betterspecs.org is a website which tells you how to write specs. And might give you something like this, right? You require the processor, great. You call describe processor because that's the class that you're testing. And then it says, oh, well, that's going to be the subject, isn't it? So the subject is the described class.new. So already there's this dryness. There's this really cool kind of inference to say, I know what the described class is. You told me on line 3. So from now on, I'm just going to use described class. And I know that you've got this core thing, which is a subject. And then we all love our lets. Who here hates lets? Okay, all right. Well, we'll see how far we can get there today. So we all then have like something like a let because, well, why not? We know from the front what we want the expectation to be. We expect it to be this output. So then we might have a, whoops, wrong key. Then we might have a context, and in that, well, actually I need to call the process, right? So I've got a subject.process in a before block, and then I come down to the test and we go, oh my God, this test is so good. It is one line, right? It does everything. It expects that the subject's output is the expected output. Fantastic. Who thinks that's a good test? Okay, a few of us. In a lot of places I've been at, they look at that and they go, yeah, this is the best thing you've written ever. Just look at my LinkedIn and 90% of those companies would think that's great. I used to think this was great, right? I used to think this was great. So if we take a little step back, everything's a function, including our tests, right? So our tests are also kind of follow that, like the input of your function is your given, your kind of beforehand. Your function is like when what exactly executes, and then your then is your expectation of the changed world of the output. And another way of putting that is arrange, act, assert, just depending on which school you went to. So you could alternately write something like this, which kind of looks very similar. You still have your described processor, but in here I'm not using the described class. Right? So, oh yeah, a bit of duplication. I'm writing process and you take this file from my fixtures, whatever it is, get the processor. I'm not using a before step. I'm not using a subject to hide the processor away. And if you've got a test file that's 200 lines long, you might be scratching your head where the hell that subject is. You may have multiple subjects along the way of a 2,000 line RSpec file. Whereas here, I don't have that, right? I literally have on line 6 how to run it. And on, well, line 6 is how to set it up, and line 7 is how to run it. And the beauty of this is, amongst other things, if I cut and paste that code, it runs, right? If I'm a new developer and I come to this code base and I'm like, how do I call the processor? I've got documentation right there on how to run it. And it's beautiful because I can see exactly how to run it. And if you don't think new developers come to your code base, just come and visit your specs 6 months later. You are a new developer because trust me. And then here, what does it matter that I've copied the output a number of times and I have a string in here rather than a variable that may or may not have been set or overwritten or not called, etc. This very clearly shows me that for this input, for this arrangement, for this action, I get this output. And so often I've been in code bases where they equate something to a variable, whether it's a let variable or some other thing. And so often I've found examples where they're comparing null with null, right? So the name says this is the expected output. The thing says it's there. And then I run a test and I'm like, well, why did my test pass? Because I was test driving it. Why is it already passing? And I work out that they had an object with all these nulls in it, and they were checking against values that had not been set by the time I got to the test. And 50% of these things were null values, okay? So I personally love that, and you've got cut and paste. You can endorse me on LinkedIn for cut ampersand paste or cut and paste. I'm an expert in both. You've got cut and paste. You can deal with a bit of repetition. You can also deal with a bit more reading, right? I mean, if you went to agentic AI and said, "Hey, show me how this thing works," or any AI, you would expect it to write, "Well, when I run this line 6, and this is how you run it. Would you like me to run it?" And line 7, then this is the output, right? It doesn't make it obfuscated and hides things around. So we're talking about better specs. I wish that we don't go there, but there are even better specs. Has anyone heard of even better specs? All right, so it's interesting because even better specs, I believe they start with something like better specs had a great time and place, and we're very supportive of what they've done, but maybe there's time to move on. Maybe I just read it with my slant, but I think even better specs basically mostly agrees with what I do and literally just disagrees with everything better specs does. So let's cover off a few things. So they've got some principles. Test must be self-contained. I don't know if the not dry is in their documentation or if I've just added that for good measure. Probably I've added it, but the idea is self-contained. Now, if those two tests, one was a one-liner, I mean, you could argue, well, the description told me what it was going to do, but it wasn't self-contained. I couldn't cut and paste that and run it, put it somewhere else, right? I couldn't just move it. I couldn't cut and paste and run it. So this idea of self-contained, to me, for tests, I'm not talking about each one of the code, I'm talking about the tests that we write, probably a good idea. Tests should follow the arrange, act, assert pattern. Again, often you look at a test and you're like, well, what's the input? And you're talking with somebody and they're like, I don't know, it's somewhere up in the subject, let's, and whatever other stuff. Whereas again, if you make it very clear, and it's interesting because if you run AI, it will generate code and often say, this is the arrange step, this is the act step, and this is the assert step. Just delete those and then just say you wrote the code. But I do like at least knowing that you're thinking about that idea, right, of arrange, act, and assert. Oh, stop using lets. So even better specs actually does say don't use lets. There's a number of reasons. One, mostly, is that they are lazily evaluated, and once you have lots and lots of context and nesting, it can be very, very difficult to work out where something is evaluated, when something is evaluated, why it didn't get evaluated, etc. And it takes away from that self-containment. When I was working at Fresho, we don't have any Fresho people here. Oh, we do? We have. Oh, right in front and center. We've got a Fresho person. They actually went out of their way and removed every let in the code base. Okay, I've since then, it's interesting, like about change. Since then, I've moved on, jumped into a bunch of businesses, and they're like, "No, you're not using at variables here." And it's like, "Why don't you just put this in a let?" So I've gone on to using lets a little bit. But I'm kind of, I'm okay either way, but I'm not a fan. As soon as lets get complicated, I'm like, well, I told you so, just don't use them. They say no shared examples. Who here does use shared examples? Right, so again, I've been bitten. I've loved them and hated them. Like when you're writing some repetitive code or you just need something that just acts this way, or when you have a good pattern, it can kind of save you a little bit of headache. To say this is another controller, does it act like a controller should? And it's like just does a bunch of things. Maybe it's a good thing, but in general, I'd be very wary of any shared examples. If you need something, I'd much rather, as Tom mentioned, just stick to plain Ruby. Just put a method. Just put a method up the top and just call that method rather than this, it should something behave like, and then it's hard to find it sometimes because it's a different naming of where it's implemented versus where it's called. Only data you need. So often I've seen people create a user object and have given it a name, email, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, why'd you put all? Oh yeah, because users have a name, email, social handle, etc. I go, well, what if I delete the name? And I delete the name and it's like, oh shit, it worked. Like, why did it work? Do you not have validation on your name or whatever? And I think in general, it's a good principle to have. It's a test-driven principle, right? Because initially you would have a user object with no data. And then when you add the name field, it would be an optional field. And then when you add validation, you would verify that it's validated in whatever scenarios you want. So to me, this one, again, you would clear up your test so much if often you just didn't have the unneeded data that people just like, I don't know, I think I need all these things. And you're like, really? I don't think you do. Mock external stuff. Still surprised that in a bunch of places, I mean, even where I work right now, one of the test suites reaches out to S3, and it's just like there are ways and patterns around that. So yes, mock external stuff. It will make a test faster. It will make them run on an airplane. It's usually one of the best ways just to kind of check. There's a bunch of places that this has hit me, and not just the most recent place. Oh, we're going to go, just before we go to a few more tips, one last thing they said there, and I think, well, I kind of mentioned, but I'll give you a quick story. So I said, don't use describe_class, right? And even better specs, I think they're okay with it. I think they're like, yeah, that's fine. The reason I don't like it is at 2 in the morning, exception comes up. I was on call in the company. I get this thing. I go open up my PagerDuty. I open up whatever monitoring software I've got. And I see like some blah, blah command, execute, throws an error. And I'm like, what the hell does this even do? So what I do? Cut and paste expert, right? I cut and paste it, search the code base. I can't find anything that calls that command, right? I can't find anything that says blah, blah command to variables. So I'm like, well, there's no test for this or whatever. In the end, there were tests, but I would have had to search for describe_class to parameters, which is not easy to search because then it finds every single test, right? So by having your duplication, by saying this is the name of the command pattern or the object I'm calling in the test, that duplication, when you need it, can help you, right? Because you can search for that easily and you go, oh, where have I called the CSV processor? Oh, here. Oh, in the test as well. Great. So a few more tips. If you are writing some tests and you are seeing them fail first, try and make sure you don't get these failures, right? So often you get a test failure and it's like, true is not false. And you're like, yeah, I know that. But what is the thing that was meant to be truthy, right? Because all you needed to do was call the test just one thing earlier to say user email is, so rather than saying, is the user email there or something like that, you could have called to say, does this object include a user email or something like that, to say, oh, it's missing that. And often we fall into that. The other one is square brackets on nil, right? So, I mean, there's ways around this, but still a bunch of times you get somebody not testing that the thing exists before you call the square brackets on it, it comes into a test. And then you've got other classics like magic numbers, 1 is not 2. All right, let's give you this is my favorite one, I think. Make unimportant test code obviously meaningless to the reader. So often I've seen things like, service ID, and it's like a legit service ID. I've seen UUIDs, which are production UUIDs in test code, right? Why? Because they were hacking around in the database, took the first best user, cut their thing through the UUID in there, and it's there, right? They've put a key, and they've put the real production or the testing key in the key, or they've put the key in there going, well, it has to look like this. And I say, well, why don't I just call it the key? Oh, no, it will fail. And often I do it, and especially if you got mocked collaborators, it will pass, right? Because all it's doing is checking did the key get passed to the next function that's going to call this? And yes, it is. So I'm very, very pro this. I think this is also highlighted in a talk that's linked on the repo, which is a guy who talks about testing a lot. Name will come to me. No, it won't. I'll mention it right at the end. But he talks exactly about this. And then one that you'll see any code base that I touch is you'll have UUIDs like this, right? Again, so often people either, and I'm okay with not testing UUIDs. I mean, generally pro not testing UUIDs, but sooner or later you get a scenario where you do. Most recently, it was on an API and we had Swagger, and the Swagger was written using RSpec. So RSpec would generate the tests and the tests would generate the output. And the output was visible for anyone in the world or anyone who had access to that documentation to try and run. And obviously, if you got IDs, you're going to have IDs all through that. But once you have real UUIDs, there were two problems. One, every time you regenerated the Swagger documentation, which you wanted checked in, you would have conflicts. So that wasn't good. And two, if you had special UIDs, and you may have special UIDs for certain things like plan or some kind of service level agreement that you go, yep, we've got 3 UIDs, we happen to have to be one of these. This makes it pretty obvious to the person seeing the tests that this is actually just a fake placeholder, all good, very easy to see. With the Swagger documentation, what we ended up doing was putting a mock around the way UIDs were generated. So they were basically that, and then the last number would just increment. So it meant every time you ran the tests, as long as no new tests were added, all those numbers were generated exactly the same way each time. And it meant when you looked at the documentation, it was pretty obvious there's UUIDs because that was the documentation, but they were all placeholder ones. And then finally, as a last kind of gift to you, like I mentioned a couple of times being anti-dry. And I had a look, and this is the terminology that's a little bit on the web. It's about make your tests damp, descriptive and meaningful phrases versus dry, right? So there is a time and place for dry. I don't think tests are a spot for that. I think this is a classic example of learn to type, learn to read, spend the time reading those tests, make sure they're descriptive, meaningful, they are all in one spot, you can easily run them, you can easily understand what's going on. That could be a mantra that could help you make your tests a little bit more repetitive, a little bit more duplicated, but much, much easier, more helpful for new developers, for you coming back to the code, for just being able to grok what's going on there. And even the example I gave you at the beginning, that better specs versus even better specs, the better specs version, even though it was drier, it was longer. And so often I've seen people start a test class go, oh, no, this is going to grow. And it's like, it never grows. It's just this read the thing, jump down here, find the subject, go down here, find the before block, go down here, find out that there's a let's thing, and you're just jumping up and down rather than having it all in one place. Thank you. I highly recommend that you check out Even Better Specs GitHub.io. I don't even know who the people are behind it. Practice damp over dry. The GitHub repo is connected to the link of this issue on the Ruby Australia GitHub or there. There is that video by the Primogen, and hang on, we'll get the other one because that's just fair, isn't it? If I go there, then right down the bottom, this is, who's this? Justin Searles. Justin Searles. He does a lot of talks about testing. So thank you very much.
I haven't really got a good question prepared, but I just want to say, I think the original, like the title was something like what you didn't like about tests. And I thought, oh no, I'm not going to like this talk. But in the end, I agreed with everything you said. I really, so I did like the talk. I think at the beginning you mentioned something about refactoring. I don't have a specific question, but just wanted to also say that I feel like that's like one of the most important reasons to write the test is so you can refactor confidently later on. And yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, thanks for the kind words. On refactoring, I think there's two things, right? You've got a function and you just know there's a better way of doing it, a faster way. Maybe there's this extra thing that you need to kind of just confirm. That's great. But as soon as you're moving the world, as soon as you're refactoring from a class to a command pattern, as was demonstrated beforehand, or something like that, all of those unit tests are out the window, right? Because those unit tests are all about to get ripped up and say, hey, this is no longer connected to this, connected to that. And this is why I also highly, highly recommend you have two levels of tests. Your integration tests, so you know that even if you move everything underneath, everything still works. And they can be light and not across everything. And then you have your unit tests just to be able to do that refactoring at that lower level. But just to understand, and for people who may have differing opinions or maybe haven't kind of come across this, if you are modifying within a class, unit tests are great. But as soon as you rip that class out and move it somewhere else, I believe you can throw those unit tests out to a degree and you have to use integration tests. Any other questions? Yes, we got one over here. Oh, there and here and.
You were talking at near the start about shared examples.
Yep.
Like, how does that work with fixtures? Is that what you were talking about, or is that something different?
So shared examples are where you have somewhere in your code an example which happens to be like a template for running a bunch of RSpec tests. So typically I've seen them work reasonably well around controllers, where you're saying you're authorized, you get a 200 response, the response is JSON, it follows some other kind of pattern. So you can just say, this endpoint behaves like it should, and it goes off there and runs that template of tests. So that's nothing to do with fixtures. I'm not a big fixture user. Fixtures, my understanding is you have, like I had in this example, AI, a fixture directory which may store like something, right? And mostly I've seen them with things like VCR, right? So people make a call to a third-party service, record that gets put into a directory, and you can call against that over and over again, or it's fake data, or it's fake other things.
The example I was thinking of was like a CSV file that we use in 5 different tests. Like, is that what you're saying we shouldn't do?
Yeah, so my view is having that CSV file at the integration spec, great, that's fine. But having that at the unit test so that you then have that, and obviously what ends up happening is people copy the whole CSV file. People say, when I read the file, and it's like, where's the file? You got to go and find it somewhere and see it. I much prefer to have inline CSV where you're literally just like, when this thing gets read in, this thing happens, and have as few of those tests and have most of the logic deeper in, just to say, well, when this thing happens, our line processor works. And then the line processor is that I don't care about the CSV fixture, I just need to do the right thing. So yeah, in general, I'm
from jumping up and down to control tabbing between.
Correct. So not a fan.
Nice.
We'll take the last question there. Hello. Thank you. I really love the talk. And I'd like to ask you for your opinion on unit and integration tests regarding this. If I have to be honest, my eyes bleed when I saw the example that you showed, because I saw that we were actually making a direct call to the file system to get the CSV file, which would be fine for integration test, in my opinion, but not for a unit test.
Correct.
But I wanted to ask for your opinion on that, and also in database calls, especially when we use Ruby on Rails. Sometimes this is kind of it's sometimes hard to write unit tests if we are too down in the level. Well, basically, I'd like to understand your opinion about writing unit tests for Ruby on Rails code and about mocking files and database calls.
I mean, that sounds like a whole nother discussion, doesn't it? So in general, I am pro a few lightweight integration tests, and then everything else should just be very tight unit tests. So even better specs, for example, is anti-controller tests, right? And RSpec has moved on from having controller tests, because what controller tests you used to do is you used to say, when I hit this endpoint, the controller goes and does everything, right? The way I have written controller specs in the past is when these parameters are passed in, this controller will call this command pattern with these parameters, right? So it's like, did it wire up from here to here? There's a very lightweight unit test. It's not the way most people do controller specs. And certainly for controller specs, what it does is assures you that you don't have fat controllers, right? It gives you that single responsibility. They're literally for controlling what parameters get through to where and why, and you may have like maybe one if statement in there maximum. And so at that point, you're mocking out everything, right? Because you're saying, when I reach there, then it hits the mocks. On the database and Rails active record, that's a hard one because it's so intertwined to go out and say, hey, I'm going to write a test against this model that's then going to verify that the right validation was called or that the right database query was called, is senseless to me. So I think probably what you're better, I mean, the test should be driving that out. So then you're all right, well, I don't want to blow my model up so much that I can't test it. So maybe this stuff belongs somewhere else in like a more of a repository pattern or the command kind of pattern where you're going, hey, this command dictates how we interact with a bunch of objects. It's going to create this, send an email, put this on the queue, and then do these other two things. So at that point, you can test that as a collaborator to say, hey, did this really collaborate here, here, here? And then your Rails active model is literally just to save it to the database, at which point you won't have to test against the database. Hopefully that kind of answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for the